Welcome to The Debate. Today, our discussion is rooted in a fascinating article featured on Mission Green, which is a segment of Project Plain Talk. We are diving deep into the Global Catastrophic Risks 2026 report, which was just published on March 4th by the Global Challenges Foundation.
Yeah, and it is a heavy read. I mean, we are talking about an incredibly detailed, urgent assessment of the interconnected threats to humanity and our environment.
It really is. The central premise is staggering, but it's completely backed by empirical data. Earth has now breached 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, ocean acidification being the most recent casualty there, where the report makes it definitively clear that we have left the incredible stability of the Holocene epoch behind, and we are now deep into the Anthropocene, an era where human activity is the dominant influence on climate and the environment.
Right. And the report's main diagnosis is that our current governance systems are dangerously fragmented. It basically demands this sweeping shift toward unified multilateral planetary governance to manage what it calls a temporary overshoot of our planet's limits.
Which brings us to the core question we are tackling today. To survive these interconnected risks, must we completely overhaul global multilateral governance into a unified planetary system, exactly as the report argues? Or, given the reality of current geopolitical gridlock, is it more pragmatic and effective to rely on unilateral, and ad hoc solutions?
Well, I look at this report and honestly, I think it suffers from a massive optimism bias. We can't just rely on top-down multilateralism. I take the position that ad hoc, localized, or unilateral actions are the only realistic mechanisms we have left to act quickly enough.
And I take the opposing view. Sweeping, interconnected, multilateral governance isn't just a utopian dream. It is the only viable systemic solution to deeply interconnected planetary risks. Look, the science here makes it impossible to defend keeping things the way they are. The report proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that catastrophic risks simply cannot be governed in silos anymore because they are physically linked.
I mean, the physical linkages are definitely the strongest part of the report. The science they cite is very robust.
Exactly. The text relies heavily on frameworks from Fatima Denton and Johan Rockström to illustrate this. They use Greenland as the prime example. What begins at the Jakobshavn ice sheet does not stay in Greenland. It's a completely transnational mechanism.
Right, because that ice melts and releases massive amounts of fresh water directly into the Labrador Sea.
Yes, and when that much fresh water hits the ocean, it changes the water's density. That density shift basically nudges the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the AMOC. And when the AMOC shifts, it alters weather patterns across half the planet. Suddenly, you have a situation where melting ice in the Arctic is causing the Amazon rainforest to dry out faster, and the global monsoon systems begin to drift.
It's a terrifying domino effect.
It is. And the profound insight from the report is that these tipping points are not regional breakdowns, they are planetary reorganizations. So my argument is that our governance must mirror this physical reality. You cannot manage an integrated Earth system with fractured sovereign-first policies. We require unified planetary commons law, and crucially, we need the systematic inclusion of global South voices to manage this stabilization, because they are on the front lines of those shifting monsoons.
I acknowledge the undeniable physical interconnectedness of those environmental threats. The science regarding the AMOC and the cascading effects from Greenland to the Amazon is brilliant. But I sharply contest the proposed governance solution, and my position is rooted right in the critical review portion of the text itself. The fundamental weakness of this report is what its own reviewers call an optimism bias on feasibility.
You think a planetary commons treaty is too optimistic?
Completely politically detached. The diagnosis of the Earth system is flawless, but the prescription is utopian. The report proposes mechanisms like a new planetary commons treaty, reforming the UN Charter, specifically Article 109, and creating a UN Future Generations Commissioner. Let's be real. In the deeply polarized geopolitical environment of 2026, those proposals are virtually impossible to execute. Relying on them is a dangerous distraction from what actually works.
But if we don't aim for those broad treaties, we're essentially giving up on a systematic cure.
I'm not saying we give up. I'm saying our survival will not depend on broad multilateral treaties that take decades to ratify. It will depend on fragmented, minilateral, and unilateral successes. We are seeing this already. Look at the unilateral US AI executive orders or the ad hoc asteroid surveys conducted by NASA and the ESA. These are localized, technically proficient actions that bypass the agonizingly slow UN processes and actually get things done.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on the timeline of risk versus the timeline of reform. You emphasize that UN processes are slow, but that is precisely why we must commit to overhauling them now. The risks are accelerating way beyond our current capacity to mitigate them.
Accelerating risks are exactly why we can't wait for the UN.
But ad hoc measures can't scale to meet them. Look at the sheer speed of the emerging threats detailed in the report. Risk 1 highlights that global mean temperatures hit 1.55 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels back in 2024. That warming is already triggering the cascading disruptions we just discussed. But it's not just climate. Look at Risk 4, the integration of AI into military decision-making.
Yeah, the AI section of the report is incredibly alarming.
It is, and the report warns that AI is shrinking OODA loops to a point where human diplomacy cannot intervene.
Let's break down what an OODA loop actually is for a second. It stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. In simple terms, it's just the time it takes a military commander to spot a threat, figure out what it means, and pull the trigger.
Right, and AI is compressing that decision window from minutes down to literally milliseconds. It's cutting human judgment out of the loop entirely. Denise Garcia's article within the report argues convincingly that fragmented, voluntary governance is wholly insufficient here. Because these risks are moving so fast, we need overarching binding treaties immediately, treaties that mandate meaningful human control and force the inclusion of private sector actors into a multilateral framework. AI is evolving faster than voluntary rules can contain it.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The very timeline argument you are making actually defeats the position that we should rely on broad multilateralism. You are absolutely correct that AI and military decision-making is moving at breakneck speed. The report explicitly cites the 2025 drone strikes on Russian bombers, as well as the integration of AI in conflicts in Gaza, Ukraine, and between India and Pakistan.
Which proves my point. It's everywhere. We need a global rulebook.
But the technological reality is moving in days and weeks, while multilateral diplomatic consensus moves in years and decades. We fundamentally do not have the time to negotiate a binding, overarching global AI treaty that pleases every sovereign state and every private tech company. By the time the ink is dry, the technology will have evolved 5 generations.
So we just let the tech companies and individual militaries regulate themselves?
I'm saying we have to rely on the actors who actually control the technology furthermore. If you look closely at the text, the report provides absolutely no cost-benefit analysis or phased implementation roadmap for these grand governance structures. It diagnoses the gap beautifully, but it completely fails to explain the financing or the verification mechanisms needed for a global AI treaty. How do you verify what code a sovereign military is running on its servers? Broad multilateralism is not just slow, it is often an academic exercise that fails to provide immediate policy utility in the face of rapid technological threats.
But relying on ad hoc measures leaves us entirely vulnerable to the erosion of the rule-based order. And that brings me to the efficacy of our existing global institutions. The report is clear. We have to move from allowing this erosion to actively strengthening our legal foundations. Consider Risk 3, weapons of mass destruction.
The nuclear threat is definitely back at the forefront.
It is, and the text outlines the terrifying erosion of decades-old regimes like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the nature of the threat has changed. Wilfred Wan of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute examines how we are now facing multi-domain escalation.
Multi-domain meaning across land, sea, air, space, and cyber.
Exactly. We have an entanglement of nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities. Cyber, space, AI, and disinformation are all entangled now. This blurs the threshold between conventional and nuclear conflict. Imagine a scenario where a cyber attack temporarily blinds an early warning satellite. Is that a conventional cyber operation, or is it the precursor to a nuclear first strike?
The ambiguity is the real danger there.
Right. And you cannot manage multi-domain, highly entangled escalation with unilateral executive orders or a patchwork of minilateral agreements among just a few allies. If that cyber attack is misinterpreted, the lack of broad, multi-domain international agreements makes unintended escalation almost inevitable. We need modernized, multilateral institutions because the risks themselves cross every conceivable domain.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the report's own most successful case study? Because I think the text actually proves that our existing broad institutions are largely medieval, and that technical minilateralism is what actually works.
You're referring to the asteroid defense section?
Yes. Risk 5, near-Earth asteroids. The report highlights the very real close call we had with the asteroid 2024 YR4 in January and February of 2025.
But that was a massive success for international cooperation. The UN's International Asteroid Warning Network, the IAWN, and the Space Mission Planning Advisory Group, the SMPAG, they successfully monitored the threat. They issued the first ever notification to all UN states. That is the system working.
They sent an alert. That is a victory for information sharing, sure. But let's talk about the odds for a second. This was an object with a 1 in 43 chance of impacting Earth. That is a 2.3% probability.
Which is uncomfortably high.
If you told me my flight had a 1 in 43 chance of crashing, I absolutely wouldn't get on the plane. And the terrifying part of the report is this. There are more than 39,000 known near-Earth orbits and approximately 300,000 small ones that remain entirely undetected. If 2024 YR4 had actually required deflection, those UN networks had absolutely zero operational capacity to stop it.
Well, because the UN doesn't have a space program.
Exactly. The actual technical capability to track these objects and deflect them lies entirely with a few well-funded national space agencies. This is what minilateralism is. Minilateralism is basically the idea that instead of trying to get 190 countries in a room to agree on a rule, you get the 3 or 4 countries that actually have the technology to just sit down and solve the problem. It is specific nations with the budgets and the engineering prowess that actually possess the capability to save lives, not broad UN decrees.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The asteroid example actually perfectly illustrates the danger of leaving operational capacity in the hands of a few wealthy nations.
How is that a danger if they're the only ones who can deflect it?
Because it highlights the report's crucial third, required shift, moving from imbalance to inclusion. If we rely solely on unilateral or minilateral technological prowess, we leave the entire global population at the mercy of the geopolitical priorities of a few powerful actors. What happens if an asteroid is projected to hit a developing nation, but deflecting it costs billions, and the nation with the technology decides it's not a strategic priority?
I think planetary defense is a pretty universal priority.
Maybe for an asteroid, but what about the climate? We see this imbalance vividly in Risk 2, ecological collapse. The report uses the RLC precedent to show how regional collapses cascade, and it explicitly states that major biomes approaching thresholds of collapse hit the world's poorest populations the hardest. Unilateral governance allows powerful industrialized nations to prioritize their own domestic economic growth over planetary stability.
But those industrialized nations are also driving the green tech revolution.
Sure, but they can afford the adaptation technologies while the global south bears the brunt of the ecological cascade. This is why the report argues so strongly for linking top-down geopolitical power rebalancing with bottom-up nature-based solutions. The only way to force compliance from powerful actors is through top-down accountability.
Like what, specifically?
Like the proposal in the text to make ecocide an internationally recognized crime. Without multilateral enforcement, unilateral actors will always choose their own short-term interests over the planetary commons. You need a legal mechanism that says destroying a major biome is a crime against humanity.
I come at it from a different way. The idea of making ecocide an international crime or forcing compliance through top-down geopolitical power rebalancing sounds morally appealing, but it runs straight into the critical weakness identified in the report, a severe lack of practical enforcement.
We enforce international law in other arenas, like war crimes.
Barely. And the text offers very few concrete mechanisms for actually enforcing this environmental accountability on powerful nations. What global police force is going to arrest the leadership of a major superpower for prioritizing their domestic economy? It's just not going to happen.
So we just accept that powerful nations can destroy the planetary commons without consequence?
I'm saying we have to deal with reality. Furthermore, the report lacks precise quantification comparing these risks. It gives us that 2.3% probability for the YR4 asteroid, which is highly specific, but it provides mostly qualitative assessments for the other risks. What is the annual probability of a nuclear escalation versus an ecological cascade?
Does it matter if they are both existential?
Yes, it matters for resource allocation. Without precise comparative risk rankings, top-down centralized prioritization is virtually impossible. A unified global body wouldn't know where to allocate resources efficiently because everything is labeled a catastrophe. Instead, what we see in reality, and what the report actually touches on when discussing nature-based adaptive governance, is that private sector actors, local civil society groups, and smaller coalitions are already taking the lead.
I agree there is great work happening at the local level.
Right. They are implementing bottom-up solutions without waiting for a unified global mandate that frankly will never arrive. They are restoring wetlands, innovating in sustainable agriculture, and building resilient microgrids. That is where the real action is.
But those bottom-up solutions, while incredibly valuable, will simply be washed away if the macro systems collapse. It doesn't matter how resilient your local microgrid is if the AMOC shuts down and alters the climate of the entire hemisphere.
Which is why we need targeted, technically capable minilateral coalitions to address the macro threats, not a slow-moving global parliament.
To summarize my position in light of our discussion today, governing a highly interconnected Earth system in fragmented silos is quite simply a recipe for catastrophic collapse. The evidence presented by the Global Challenges Foundation is irrefutable. We have breached the planetary boundaries. The melting of Greenland directly impacts the Amazon. AI systems are integrating with nuclear command and control. These are not isolated, localized issues that can be solved by ad hoc coalitions or unilateral executive orders.
They are interconnected, yes, but the solutions don't have to be monolithic.
Managing our temporary overshoot in the Anthropocene and returning to a safe and just operating space by mid-century requires holistic, planetary-level cooperation. We must rebuild trust in the rules and modernize our legal norms, rather than trending inward toward nationalism and isolation. It is an immense political challenge, but it is a biological and physical necessity.
And to summarize my sketch, while the scientific diagnosis of the interconnected risks in this report is flawless, the prescription of utopian global governance is fundamentally flawed. We are operating in a highly polarized environment. The UN Charter is not going to be reformed, and a planetary commons treaty is politically stalled. Insisting on a unified multilateral approach is not just overly optimistic, it is a massive misallocation of crucial time.
You really believe the UN is entirely obsolete here?
I believe the rapid evolution of AI, the multi-domain nature of modern conflict, and the specific technical requirements of asteroid deflection all prove that agility is far more important than universal consensus. Pragmatism, technical prowess, and fast-moving minilateral coalitions are humanity's best actual tools for navigating the severe challenges of the coming decades.
Well, despite our strong disagreement on the governance mechanisms, I think there is clear shared ground between us regarding the undeniable severity of the evidence presented in the text.
Absolutely.
We both acknowledge that humanity has breached the stability of the Holocene. The physical science is clear, the risks are compounding, they are accelerating, and we must adapt rapidly.
The gravity of the situation is not in dispute at all. The report perfectly captures our current existential predicament by quoting the biologist Edward O. Wilson. It's a quote that really stuck with me. He observed that humanity is a danger to itself because we possess a Star Wars civilization with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology.
That is a chillingly accurate description of where we are in 2026.
It really is. That perfectly encapsulates the tension we are grappling with today. We have godlike technology, but we are trying to regulate it with medieval institutions.
It really does. And on that note, we will leave the listener to form their own conclusions. We don't claim an ultimate victory for either the overarching multilateral approach or the agile minilateral approach. The tension between the need for unified planetary governance and the reality of fragmented, pragmatic action is an ongoing challenge. There is so much more depth to this issue that we encourage you to explore further within the source material itself.
Thank you for joining us for this discussion.
We greatly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the debate. As a reminder, today's discourse was directly inspired by the Global Catastrophic Risks 2026 report, which was featured in a thought-provoking article on Mission Green, a segment of Project Plain Talk. We encourage all of you to examine your own perspectives on how humanity should govern its way through the Anthropocene. Until next time, keep questioning and farewell.